It is Saturday, November 12th, 2016, and welcome to this episode of Code Evolution. Today I wanted to do a podcast kind of covering the topic of function signatures. Now, function signatures is something that I'm working on and trying to create a video to explain how they work, and I find it to be very difficult to explain function signatures. And you know, I realize that it's taken me really a couple years to actually get my head fully wrapped around them. And so let's talk about the motivations for function signatures first. So for example, if you have a function and that function has a parameter, whatever that might be, we'll just do a string. Okay. And so let's go ahead and make some more room here. There we go. So we have this function, and its signature basically is what parameters it allows, basically, right? So in that way, we could say, okay, a different signature could be, C, and then, number, okay? So it doesn't matter what the function does inside, but the signature is basically what it does, and including what it returns, right? So it would be important to say, let's say, it returns a boolean, just to be silly, okay? Now, so this being that this is the basic signature of this function. And obviously we could keep going down this rabbit hole of what is possible in a function. You could have an optional parameter. You can have default parameters, right? So, number could be 1, right? These are different varying possibilities that functions can have. Now, here's the thing though. In the beginning, optional parameters weren't necessarily a thing as much as, say, you could have, again, an additional signature. So let's say if you wanted to have, instead of this just being optional, right? But here's the trick, and this is the important thing that it's really taken me a long time to try to figure out how to express properly. And that is the function that exists that is the closest to the actual contents, right? The one at the bottom is, at least what I call, it's the internal signature. It's the one that the internal block of code actually is what it recognizes as the truth, okay? So any subsequent signatures you might have above it, right, are external signatures. So this is where it gets, again, really interesting, is let's say, for example, if I wanted to have this function to be, we'll have number, okay, and this, you could have these two varying possibilities, and then you could have both, right? Well, how do you make this work? And you're going to see that, TypeScript is going to be, complaining at me going, what the heck are you trying to do? And so what I want to separate out is that the signatures above the final one, the one that's closest to the contents, are external, essentially what the consumer of the function can do. It's what they're allowed to do, right? Whereas the last one is the internal signature that the code itself, the last one here, is this is what the code itself expects to see. But this is not the one that is exposed to the user. It's just the ones above it that are, or obviously if you didn't have any at all, then they would match up internal and externally. So what I wanted to wrap up on this section here is that you can kind of notice I could go crazy with my signatures. I could have a long list of signatures, but in reality, they're not necessary, right? All this isn't necessary because really, when you look at it, if you write your signature correctly with default parameters and union types, it's already done, right? Like, it's basically set and ready to go. So that's the key thing to remember is, you have to ask the question, do you really even need a signature for the most part? Most of the time, no. And the thing is that one of the things I want people to realize and really emphasize is, if you're writing fancy signatures for your methods, they're probably not written well. And I mean that in the sense of I have a strong opinion about this, that I've actually kind of grown into this opinion even more now that I'm using TypeScript, is you have to be very, I like to be very elegant with the API structure. In other words, functions should make sense, and that instead of having weird things like, for example, let me give you an example here. Let's start over now that you've kind of gone over this. Let's say function a, we'll say foo, and then we have parameters a, b, c, and d, right? And this is TypeScript's fine with this, okay? But what's frustrating for, I think, a lot of people, it's definitely frustrating for me, is if you actually have all these different possibilities where it's like C, D, or you've got D, A, and that's how your that's how your signatures are laid out. This is weird, and it's very frustrating because it starts to get very strange in how you try to map your functions correctly. So, I highly discourage people to, if you can't write a clean signature that just uses default parameters and doesn't need to have some crazy remixing of variables or parameters or attributes, then you've got a problem there if you're not able to do that. And you'll also find that the more that you do that, you're going to have to write more code inside of your functions to get things to work. So let me use another, I think is a really great example that I keep running into a lot. It was using like a sort, for example. That's a good example. What if you wanted to write a sort function that sorted an array, but gave you a copy of that array instead of, or sorted an array of values or whatever, and gave you a copy of it, right? So instead of sum, let's use sort. It's going to be a lot less code too. So let's just say we're going to go ahead and say sort internal, and we're just sorting numbers, so it's easy, right? And the internal is just going to do the magic of sorting, right? But let's say we wrapped it in a function because maybe we had some sort of optimization that we were considering about, making it faster, right? So we're going to say, okay, values, but we're going to go ahead and just go ahead and say number. We're going to go ahead and return that as well. And let me go ahead and zoom out a bit more here. And so then what we're going to say is values.sort return values. Okay, for now, that's all that is. And just to kind of demonstrate this whole kind of like API idea. Now, next up, we're going to say, okay, function. Now I want to do, I'm actually going to export this one. So this is my public, right? Sorting function. And I'm going to pass it some values. Okay. Now in this case, it gets interesting because what I really want to do is I don't want to sort the incoming array that someone's passing me because, or maybe that's why I want to actually call this sorted instead, right? So I'm passing in a set of values that I want to get a copy back that's sorted. I don't want to modify my original array, and values.sort does that. It takes the existing array and rearranges it. So what we're going to do to solve that problem is we're going to say sort internal, and we're going to go values.slice. And so now, because I'm calling a public API, I know that I need to do this slice before I pass it into the function that does the work, right? And that's going to save us it's going to save us a little bit of headache. Now, you could also, highly recommended, you could put a bunch of stuff in here that says no, if there's no values, you could do a throw. Hey, no values array. Okay, whatever you want to call it, right? Argument null exception, all that stuff. But this allows you for your public API to be as kind of constrictive as possible before you go off and do any things like making copies of arrays, etc., right? Because you don't want to do that. You don't want to make a copy of an array if it's empty or whatever your logic is, right? Now let's move on to the next part of this is, what if you want to go and say export function, and now we're going to do sort as an external, right, function that says ... values, right, which just means take all the arguments and turn them into an array. Okay. And then this is where this gets interesting, because sort is already making an array for you, a unique array, right? Because if I type sort and go 1, 2, 3, it's going to take these and it's going to put them, it's going to convert them into an array. Now, I don't know if, I'm going to go ahead and assume that not everybody's seen this, right? But if I go ahead and look at the actual JavaScript code, right, you'll be able to see that when you have a set of arguments that's essentially an indefinite number, TypeScript automatically converts that over to an array for you. And there's a lot of good reasons for that, including the fact that the arguments array, it really isn't an array. It's something else. It's a special object. So we don't want to be modifying it or toying with it. We want to take a copy of it and then work on it. So that's what's happening here. So again, now we're going to say, okay, I made my copy of my array, right? I know that I don't have to worry about a null reference exception because, or an argument, sorry, null exception, because I know that this is going to give me for sure an array back. So I don't have to worry about that at all. And so now I can come in here and go and do the same thing, but I don't need to do a slice. Okay, I don't need to make a copy because the user has no access to this array at all at the moment, right? We're actually creating it internally in the JavaScript code and then sorting it and then sending it back. Obviously, 1, 2, 3 seems like a bad example, right? Because we want to get back, 3 or 1, 2, 3, right? In descending order, because that's the standard here. So I hope this is kind of a point I really wanted to make, is having this kind of pattern where you have your externally exposed methods, that one of them is going to be, a set of values or whatever it is that you're passing the array, and that's fine, because that gives the flexibility for people who are familiar with that to be able to put 3, 2, 1 in an array, and that's completely valid. And you also want to have that flexibility, just like the sort function itself. You want to allow them to externally pass in this array to this, right? Or you want to be able to say, hey, I want to maybe pass around an array and pass it through a function and still work, instead of going, well, how the heck do I, call these arguments into this sort function? Wow, this is frustrating. It takes a lot of work. So again, you've got your internal, you've got your external methods, but one is a set of values, and then one is an actual array of values, and they all kind of work together in a kind of a happy format. So that's, I think, a really good one to point out. Okay, so another one I wanted to go over, just to kind of put the nail in the coffin, hopefully, is this notion where, like, as an example, if you have some sort of, let's say we're doing file operations, right? So let's say we have a function that is, and again, I'm just making fictitious stuff up here. I could import some stuff from NPM and it would work, but let's say that we have like a file read, and that file read is going to be by normal standards, is going to be a URL, or sorry, it's going to be a path and a string. And then there's going to be, because it's asynchronous, and very commonly in Node, things are going to have a callback, right? And then that callback is going to contain the actual file object. For now, let's just consider that we will just say it's an object, right? Okay, so that's really seems straightforward. But here's what you'll see quite often, and let's say like maybe more specifically, a better example, let's go ahead and do, let's say function, we'll say, I don't know, URL read, okay? And again, we'll have path, string. Okay, so we'll say that it's basically the same thing. But in the case of a URL read, you might have, well, a whole bunch of stuff. Let's say like you've got another option, another function, URL read, and then path, and then query. Okay, and then maybe you've got, for whatever reason, you can get as complex as you want, right? And then you've got another signature that's, oops, sorry, let me get, one of the reasons why it's good in TypeScript to kind of change any habits of leaving function braces at the end of the line and kind of follow more convention like in other languages is definitely to kind of drop the brace. It's not that big a deal, but an actual reason is because of function signatures. So now we've got this other URL read, right? Well, let's see, what else can we do? What about path query? Maybe we have hash. Okay, and keeping them separate for some reason, right? Now, you would think then definitely you'd want to have this one be the internal signature, the base signature, right? And you kind of want to have it like as it grows. But take a note that as you can see, it gets worse and worse and worse, right? We have this callback that keeps moving outward down the line, and you're going, wow, okay, how do I manage that? How do I make this overload signature work? Well, number one, as I've been hopefully getting across, is try to avoid doing this if you can. What you have to understand is as we keep going, and it's definitely convenient. If I want to do a URL read, so there's a nice fluid flow in how you write your code this way, right? So it's great if you can just have your parameters first and then the last part be the callback. No question that's nice to have. The problem is it can get a little bit out of hand, right? It can be very unwieldy if you have all these overloads. So some solutions to this, and I suggest, is first of all, try not to do this. Try not to make these overloads. Try to break them up into separate functions, and then kind of go from there. Then you can write maybe a kind of a host function that selects the paths for each appropriately, and then you can kind of write these things the way you'd expect. Or you could say, okay, well, what about let's walk through this, right? So let's say, like, if you start off doing this, that that you're going to have, essentially you're going to concatenate a string, and then you're going to make a callback, right? So again, one solution would be to have this function called URL read. That's the core one, right? But we're going to do a URL read internal. That's just the path and the callback, right? And then we can say, okay, great. I want to export this basic one, right? That takes the path callback. Okay. And that should resolve just fine. And then we're going to keep going. And we'll write these functions all out, right? And say, okay, well, let's do this right. We're going to URL read. Let's change this here. Path query. Right now, this may seem like a lot of work, but it's pretty straightforward, because the beauty of it is I don't have to do any if logic yet, right? The API is kind of defining itself, and the functions and how the functions work and how they are defined is unique. And again, if this was in a typed language like Java or C#, this would just work anyway, but we just don't have that luxury. So starting out by actually writing it in an API, like, oh yeah, cool, we're going to do, now we're going to read, query, and then hash, right? And I'm getting pretty obvious here. I know it seems pretty silly, but I'm trying to keep these examples simple because they get out of control after a while. Okay, so now we have 3 unique functions that are all different, and they're kind of like, oh, okay, well, that's cool. That's cool you did that, sir. But wouldn't it be nice? Somebody's thinking, well, I'd prefer it just to be all one function because I understand how it works. Well, not everybody does. So you could stop here. There's nothing wrong with writing your API this way. It's maybe not just be as elegant and as clean as some people would like, essentially from usage. So then how do we keep going? Well, okay, so we've got our URL read here that's, the outer one that we would normally be using. So now what you want to do is you want to change, and we want to actually come in here, and we're going to have our URL read internal, but we want to have one URL read external, right? Keep in mind that what we're going to have here, we do know that the full potential is that it could have all of them, right? So we need to go like this. Okay, so before we start like going down the rabbit hole of, if you can hopefully just imagine what you're going to have to do here, right? You're going to have to write a lot of code. You're going to have to write code that says, you know, if this is a string or it's a function, then do one or the other. And then you have to also kind of make this strange decision about, well, what if I pass, you know, null, null, and then a callback, right? It starts to get really weird. So, you know, it's almost like you need to kind of take the arguments and figure out what the last one is. And if the last one ends up being a string, then there's an error, right? Or you don't have a callback at all, and you're calling a URL, you're poking a URL instead of actually doing a callback, right? It's the logic just really, really starts to get insane. And this is what I kind of worry about, is you end up writing more code, and then you have to test that code, right? So you've magnified your testing like by huge amounts by trying to force overloads to work in JavaScript. Now, if I went back and, like I said, if I changed my whole scheme of having the different named methods with the different things laid out, I don't have to write more code. And it's very explicit. It tells the user, oh, okay, do this and then that. Now, here's an interesting thing that I've actually done before too, is let's say if you are more, let's say that you actually want to have a better organization here. And again, this will be my last kind of suggestion. But let's say you want to have this URL read thing. And you could do a module, right? We could say export module, and then you could say, you know, URL read, and that could be like this, right? And then you could have your different variations of these functions, right? You could say, we'll go ahead and put these in here, and you could have, you know, read path and query. All right. Again, I hope this is some good suggestions for people, because, man, it's really easy to write bad APIs without being careful. And again, writing a lot more code that you need to. Or here, let's see, we'll start with path and query. We had one here that's just with path, right? And, you know, again, it seems like a little bit, it's like, man, that's so much more to write. It's like, try to do the overloads and then come back to me. It's insanity. It's just way, if you don't know what you're doing, it's going to be, you're going to be covering not enough edge cases. Let's just put it that way. And there's our internal, and we can get rid of this because we already explained that one. All right, cool. You're gonna probably saying, oh, that's nice. You can just do URL read .path or whatever, right? Well, there is an interesting kind of workaround for this too that I've played with, and some people are like, that's weird. And I'd love to have some comments about this. So, you know, this isn't an absolute. It's just an interesting way that only in JavaScript you can really kind of pull this off. And that's having sub-functions, which is another interesting, weird thing to do. So you could say that URL read is actually this. We're going to do function URL read. Okay. And then you could say with query and hash, right? So it's a bit strange, but what you've done is you've made this API have the capability of doing something that, again, no other language can do, but it's kind of interesting. So there's something I like about this way of doing things. To me, it's not perfect, but it kind of is nice to be able to go, wow, I can actually call this, and then I have kind of sub-functions or sub-variants that, again, I didn't have to write some weird, insane amount of code, and the intention is very clear. TypeScript is going to assert our intention strongly because you're gonna have a certain number of parameters, and that's all you're gonna have. So I'm sure there's somebody out there that's going there's probably, hopefully there's one person going, yeah, that maybe hasn't seen this before, and there's gonna be another person that's like, yeah, he gets it, this is the way I do it, and I'm gonna be like, yeah, I want to hear from you too. And then there's gonna be the guy that's like, this is bad practice, it's never been done before, or like, we already made a decision about this in JavaScript Consortium 2005, never do this. I don't know. I want to hear all that stuff, because this is one that, again, I don't see this as a common pattern that people do kind of extended versions of different functions this way. But I find it, in some cases it just makes sense. It's almost like you have something you use most of the time, but then you might have some ones that you're like, a little bit different. And then the syntax is kind of nice too, because you can kind of like properly flow it in that way. So that's pretty much it. Man, I've been thinking about this a lot. I hope this wasn't too long for people, and I hope you guys got a lot out of it. Function signatures is such an interesting and difficult topic to wrap your head around, and there's so much to know, and so many ways to screw it up. So if you guys have any questions, please ask in the comments. Obviously, you can hit me up on Gitter, or follow me. Go to my GitHub, Electric Essence. And if anything, if you have any questions about this stuff, I know it's hard, and so definitely reach out. I'm hopefully, if I come up with some more stuff, I'll be putting out another video. So again, like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.